Mac Power Users, episode 653, Workflows with Chris Christensen. Hello, everyone. This is David Sparks. I am joined by my pal and yours, Mr. Stephen Hackett. How are you doing today, Stephen?
I'm great, David. How are you?
I am excellent. I am well rested, had a great vacation, ready to go take on the world. And we have a guest today. Welcome to the show, Chris Christensen.
Thanks so much.
Well, Chris, I guess I shouldn't say welcome to the show. You've been here before, but it's been a long time.
It's certainly predates Stephen.
Yeah. So Chris is a programmer or an application developer and web developer by trade, but also runs the Amateur Traveler podcast and does a bunch of cool stuff. He's had stints with various companies over the years, building great web apps for them. He's done some work with a little fruit company called Apple in the past, and we're going to talk about that later today. In fact, on More Power Users today, I didn't realize, Chris, until we were doing a pre-interview, that you're the guy who wrote the mail app for the Newton. And as soon as I heard that, I'm like, okay, that is going to be today's More Power Users because we're going to have to physically restrain Stephen when we get to that, I think.
Yeah, I still have a business card here someplace with the Newton Mailman as the title.
That's a good job title. Hey, I used that mail client in college. Check my .Mac email. So we can talk about that in More Power Users.
It wouldn't be that one. So the first version of the mail, we could talk about this in More Power Users, only connected to AOL.
Oh.
Or AOL-based services like eWorld.
It's good to know.
Because back then, that was the internet.
It's true.
Well, Chris has got a storied past and has done a lot of interesting stuff for the Mac community over the years. But I want to talk today to Chris about some of the bigger topics we're going to talk about is web development. I feel like this is something we've wanted to cover on the show for a while. Chris, pays for his shoes making apps for the web, and there's a lot to that. And we're going to talk about what's involved with it. But I also want to talk about it for power users, just to understand what is the underlying technologies. Why does our battery die with certain web apps and not with others? And let's give everybody a little bit of a foundational knowledge, and who better to teach us that than someone who actually makes their living making these things. So that's one of the main reasons I want to have you on, Chris. But also, you've got some great content creation stuff you're doing with Amateur Traveler and a bunch of other cool ideas. So I'm really looking forward to today's show. Before we get started, Stephen, do we have any announcements? I think we're pretty good today.
Yeah, I think so. I just wanted to thank everybody who backed the Kickstarter. It's been closed for a little over a week now, and super happy with how it ended up. I've gotten a few people email me or send me notes asking if they missed the Kickstarter, if they could still get their hands on a calendar, and the answer is yes. I'll have a limited number for outright sale later this year. And so keep an eye out for that. I'll announce it in a blog post on 512 Pixels, probably in October. But there will be some available. But overall, again, just thank you if you supported it. I'm super pleased with how it's gone.
Yeah. Well, that was... I have seen these random pictures from Stephen. They're getting taken for the calendar, and everybody who bought them, you guys are in for some real treats. I think even, maybe Chris will recognize a few of those pictures. I don't know.
I think see. I may have had a few of those products.
So, Chris, you are found at amateurtraveler.com. That's the website for your podcast. The travel podcast that actually talks about traveling places and not how to get the best deal on mileage and points. I kind of like that, and then on Twitter, you're Chris2X. But let's talk a little bit about kind of your journey. How did you first get into technology and kind of what led you down the path?
Well, technology actually was because my best friend in high school in junior year, his rich aunt gave him an Apple II. And so I learned to program on an Apple II because of, somebody's rich aunt, and found that programming was something that I really enjoyed doing. And so I've been a programmer now ever since, and as a paid, position for the last 41 years, I guess now. And that's how that led me into technology. And actually, technology led me into podcasting because the first podcast that I started listening to was Leo Laporte's This Week in Tech.
Yeah.
And so it was that led me into, hey, I like this podcasting stuff, and thought about doing a Mac podcast. But, Adam Christensen was already around, and who needs 2 Mac podcasts?
Yeah.
This was honestly what I thought at the time.
Yeah, Katie and I heard the same thing when we started. Nobody needs another podcast. It's okay. But your original programming position, it's hard, as an older guy, I always want to call them programmers, right? Because that's
programmer works. Yeah.
Yeah. But your original positions were application development. You predate the web in essence. And
yeah.
So I know we're going to talk later about, you working on the Newton, but was that what you're hired for at Apple, or did you do other stuff there?
No,
Okay.
I was hired for that at Apple. I had actually been at a pen-based computing company before the Newton, in the great pen scare of the late 80s, early 90s. I was at a company called Momenta, back when, pundits were writing about the keyboard was going away and we were all going to use pens. It turns out when people write about it, it's not always true. Which was an interesting lesson for me. But and that we put a computer on the front of Business or PC Computing Magazine with the perfect computer ? And PC Magazine in Germany, and all of the rags, and sold our first computer to Bill Gates as the first computer to run Windows for pen computing. And then I worked on a Smalltalk environment for a set of custom apps for that computer. And, in 3 years, we ran out of $40 million and went out of business. Made Byte Magazine's 20 biggest all-time failures list, which was a hard list to get onto. You have to have some promise and then fail. But, I've spent about 22 years at startup companies. That one, the most spectacular failure, and the other ones I think are all still around.
But I mean, you're right to get of the 20 biggest failures in technology, because every day there's another product coming out. So
right. We made it up there with the Osborne computer and the Apple III at the time before Byte themselves failed.
That's quite the company.
Man.
They've
stayed a little more well known than we were, but
that's what we call in the business irony. Anyway, I'm looking at this Momenta. It's kind of a cute little computer, and you can definitely see the age. It looks like the pen had a cord sticking out the back of it.
Yeah, it was a resistive technology. So unlike you guys were talking on writing on glass recently on the show, this one was a technology where you actually had the glass was etched with a copper substrate, and so it actually had more of a paper feel, but you basically were connecting a circuit, but then it would also wear off over time. So there's some disadvantages to that technology, and you have to have a cord to make it work.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk later today about tablets and writing because of your unique experience. But you went there, you went to Apple. Eventually, Apple lost interest in the Newton, and you left Apple, and then you went off and did.
Well, Apple was hemorrhaging cash and had to close down the Newton and also eWorld, which who hired me into Apple I worked on the eWorld application, and then Newton as part of that.
See, I had always heard that Steve Jobs was the one who killed the Newton when he came back, but so was it dead before?
I think he finished killing it, but there were big layoffs before he came back, and then eWorld was shuttered before that. But that Q4 of when it would have been 95, Apple lost about $700 million, if I'm remembering correctly. So I mean, it was in danger of going out of business.
Yeah.
And so they shut down the things that were not core to the business as they needed to. I mean, it's never held it as anything personal. So he may have also had personal things against the Newton. It was a Scully sort of project, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter. He needed to get rid of anything that wasn't the core business, as well as, half the machines that they were making, right? We all know how he rationalized the number of computers they're working on. And I was there in the unrational days. I worked for everybody but Steve Jobs. So the dark years, as we say.
Rough times. It's got to be hard working for a company where, the newspapers and computer magazines are predicting your demise every other week.
Yeah. I don't remember thinking that much about that. We had plenty to do. So
Yeah, good. But then at some point you got interest in programming for the web. When did that start up?
So the first application I did, I can't even remember what the name of it was, but it was at Apple. We launched when I was still at eWorld, a small application that was running on literally, I think it was running on SEs in the back end, sitting in a data center someplace, and we had an application that was a portal kind of app. Back when like Alta Vista and some of those things were rolling out new portals, and this is a cool technology. And so I was actually still at Apple when I started doing web programming, and then I followed the head of eWorld, Peter Friedman, who is the head of the Apple Online Services, out the door to a startup company where I was for 14 years working on web-based community applications, a system called Talk City at first, and then we were doing running community for other companies, a great variety of companies, the NBA, the WNBA, HBO, Web TV, Microsoft. I've got a great demo slide of all the different logos of companies I work with doing web-based things. At first doing chat and community-based things, then later on doing a lot of discussion board work.
So you're old enough to have started programming before the web and the application model. You've successfully created applications. What is it about the web that attracted you?
As someone so I was on the internet before the web.
Sure.
A lot of people don't remember, back in the days of FTP and Waze and all the other protocols that we used
Bulletin
before
boards.
the web.
Yeah.
Bulletin boards. I actually got my job at Apple through a first-class bulletin board dial-in software that my manager at Apple was running. So yeah, I was looking for the web before the web. In fact, when I was at HP, which was the first job out of school for about 5 years, we had a group there that was looking at hypertext and, what was going to happen with hypertext. And so, when HyperCard first happened, it's like, oh, hey, here's something that we've been looking for. And then when the web happened, it's like, oh yeah, I know what this is and I know how this can be used. Of course, I thought I did, but it's been even more useful than that. So I fell in love with the web before the web. And so it wasn't that hard then to say, hey, I want to learn more about this kind of technology. And then had the opportunity to go off and, be the EVP of engineering and operations for a web-based company, a .com company for 14 years. So through ups and downs, as one might imagine, we went to, started with 4 employees and got up to 256 and then went down to 15 when the .com bubble burst and then back up to, I don't know where they are these days, 60, 80 employees or so. They're still around.
Yeah. It's, well, you've kind of been on the journey and that's so great, And what are you doing currently?
So I left I was doing consulting for about 6 years so I could have more time to travel for Amateur Traveler, working at a variety of companies, including Time Out and TripAdvisor, were probably the two best knowns, and a couple smaller startup companies. And then somebody I worked with at 4 other companies before that was starting a new startup company called Bodeswell that was doing financial planning software. And so I joined that about a year before the pandemic. It cut it back on my travel, but it turned out to be nice to have a full-time job sitting in my office here at home. Yeah. I was working from home, long before it was cool. And so I've been doing that for the last 3 years. Last year, we actually launched for American Express My Financial Plan, which was our software with their brand, so that their users were coming in and using our financial planning software, and they liked it and they bought us. So in between actually pitching this show and being on the show, I've changed my employer and I went from a 6-person company to a 60,000 person company, and I work for American Express.
Well, Chris, you've had quite a journey, and but what I love about that is you're old enough to have been there at the beginning with the Apple II. You've really seen this industry mature and evolve over the course of your career. Any insight you have over the computer industry as a whole from that journey?
Well, I don't know if we can ever say that the computer industry has matured based on the headlines I read, but I tell people I used to work on the web when it was entirely steam driven. But It is, I think it's a lot of fun. My kids occasionally get jaded by the news and things like that, and I understand why they do. But this is if you're a nerd, this is a pretty amazing time to live when you've got, this amazing tool in your pocket and you're, sitting in front of your M1 laptop and, you've got the web that you can look up answers. Remember when you had to just go to the Encyclopedia World Book when you were trying to settle the argument at dinner time? At least that was the way it was in my house. It's a pretty cool time. And I've just, thoroughly enjoyed that ride. And in terms of what the web has become, has been pretty darn cool.
I distinctly remember in the probably late 80s logging in, dialing into somewhere. It wasn't like AOL. It wasn't one of the like big systems, but it was the first time I kind of found my way onto the internet of connected computers, not necessarily the web. And the screen showing up and saying, would you like news about sports or politics? And you'd press the number for whatever you wanted. And actual news would start showing up on your screen. And I just thought that I had unlocked the key to the world.
Well, and I remember the first time I booked my own air ticket before the web on, AOL when they had, what was it, Easy Saber and things like that. And it was just amazing that you could do this yourself. You didn't have to talk to a travel agent or you didn't have to call anybody. And of course now, that's just so routine.
The other thing that's interesting about your career, and I want to come back to this later, is that, you started at a time where one programmer or application developer would kind of, roll the whole enchilada. And now things have gotten so much more specialized. And I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes and no. Things have gotten more specialized, but they also, when we're building software these days, especially web-based software, we stand on the shoulders of giants. We 6 of us built a company that American Express bought, and it's still, I find that amazing. Mm-hmm. But of course, we didn't build the software all the way down to the bits. We built on top of technologies that are out there that are freely available for people to use. So we were using React on the front end, which is a technology that I think React came from Facebook, as I recall. But I don't even know because everybody uses it these days. And we're using, Kotlin on the back end, which is freely available. You can go buy IntelliJ, and these guys made up their own back end language. And, using JavaScript or TypeScript, which is a TypeScript version of that. And do you remember the original name of JavaScript when it first came out by Netscape way back in the 90s?
I do not.
It was LiveScript, but Java was getting a lot of press, and so they renamed it. So, it's been around for a while. But because you're not building things from scratch, you can build more interesting things in a quicker period of time. And so a small team is easier, I think, these days in the software range, especially in the web-based software area. I think games, are still more difficult, but even there you've got, when you're doing application programming, you've got the engines and things like that are giving you all your geometry and things like that now, where you used to have to do that from scratch. But a lot of the web-based stuff is built on, you're standing on the shoulders of giants. So makes it a lot easier to do I mentioned, being at Momenta and spending, $40 million and then going out of business. But you can do a bootstrapped, web-based company, hire a few engineers, and not have to spend tens of millions of dollars to get a product out, which is why you get so much more innovation now. It's easier because of the web to run a company. You can get your services for payroll, for instance, without having to work with, ADP and some of the giants that took all your time, or you can get your benefits through, some other website or all of those sort of things. So it's easier to start a business now than it used to be, and it's easier to make software. The only thing is if you're going to get into this business, you have to just be willing to constantly learn, because everything you learned this year will be obsolete in a couple months.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking about that in terms of Apple and at your time there. One thing amongst many that Apple struggled with was the rise of the web, and they struggled for a long time on the software front, and they had weirdo networking, and then the iMac comes along, and Apple's like, hey, this Mac designed to get you on the internet, even though it was still like macOS 8.5 or 6 or whatever it came with. And even though it was more of kind of the same as they worked their
Right.
way towards the modern era, when think about your time at Apple then and what you've learned in the years since, like, it seems to me, as someone who's covered this industry for a long time, but not like, I'm not a developer, haven't worked at a big tech company myself, is that you see these companies sometimes struggle uh to see what's coming, and sometimes like everyone else in the room can't see it except the company. Have you been in those situations before?
Well, yeah. So I was there when actually I worked on eWorld 1.1. I was in charge of the client, and that is, as far as I know, the first time that Apple shipped an internet browser. Was as part of eWorld. We shipped an internet browser that was coming from AOL, because eWorld was AOL technology based. A lot of people don't know that, but on the other hand, AOL was Apple technology based because it was developed as a joint project between quantum computing in Vienna, Virginia, and Apple. It was going to be Apple Link Personal Edition, because Apple had a program called Personal that was called Apple Link, and it was how they ran a lot of their their dealer networks and things like that. And it was run by GE Information Systems, the people who ran CompuServe, very old technology. And they'd been trying many times to update it. And one of the first times they tried that, they were ready to ship this Apple Link Personal Edition. And then somebody at Apple, and this was before my time, backed out. I had to actually pay AOL a lot of money to get back the Apple logo, so they would not use the Apple logo on this product.
Wow.
And that's the money they used to send you all the CDs that they were sending you back in the 80s, was the money from Apple. But then when I was there, we went back to them and actually re-licensed the software that Apple had helped build and came out with this version. But I remember when I was there, we're going out with this web browser. It was a WebShark. That's something that AOL had bought. It was a piece of crap. It was not a good piece of software. And we would record bugs, and they were like, yeah, we know that. We're going to be testing it in the big lab. And what that really meant was, we need to get a web browser out there because this internet has suddenly come into being, and we really need to get there really quick. And we're going to ship it, and we know that it's got bugs in it. So, everybody was scrambling at that point. But I mean, the other thing that was happening at the same point is, we were used to paying, $5, $10 an hour for connectivity. And that was about the same time that your ISP basically started charging you a flat fee. And that's when the internet really was taking off, was when that was happening.
I feel like my childhood is littered in those free 2 hours on AOL CDs,
Oh, yeah. Well, and they made their money from the people who bought an account and used it constantly. And those would be the people in the chat rooms, for instance, like we were later on running, but also those who bought it and didn't use it at all. And those were the two places where they made money. The people who used it for 2 hours, or whatever you got with your monthly subscription, they actually lost money on.
This episode of Mac Power Users is made possible by SaneBox. Go to sanebox.com/MPU and you'll receive a $25 credit on any plan. We all have just too much email, and it's hard to know what's important and what can wait until later. And that's where SaneBox comes in, because it learns what email is actually important to you and then what isn't, saving you hours during the work week. And it works with all kinds of email programs and services. You don't have to have a special app or use their, weird email system. It works basically everywhere. I've got hooked up to a couple of Google accounts and it works fantastically there. And SaneBox gives me great email filtering. They have all these different folders you can set up. Sane Later keeps your inbox clean with only what really matters, and other stuff is saved for later for you to deal with on your own time. My favorite folder is the Sane Black Hole. You can drag a message into it and you'll never hear from the sender again. You can snooze and set reminders as well, so if your receiver doesn't reply or you don't want to see an email until Monday morning when you get back to the office, that's all really easy to do. And SaneBox is more than just filtering. You can use it to move attachments to Dropbox and other cloud services and free up precious space on your email account. SaneBox has various pricing plans starting as low as about $4 a month. Check it out with a 14-day free trial at sanebox.com/MPU, and you'll receive a $25 credit on any plan. 2/3 of MPU listeners that try SaneBox end up subscribing. I know I couldn't deal with my email without it. I think you're going to love it. Once again, that's sanebox.com/MPU.
Chris, so earlier you mentioned an M1 Mac. So you have now summoned the gods of the Apple Silicon. We need to talk about this. I mean, here's a guy who worked on, some very old hardware back in the day. But now, what do you think of what Apple's doing with the modern hardware, and how much of it have you bought?
Old hardware that ran on ARM. I think we should also maybe tell that story because...
right. Yeah, a lot of people don't know that Apple's introduction into ARM was the Newton. The lasting thing that came out of the Newton was Apple's love for the ARM architecture, and they bought into that company in that process. And that is probably the number one thing that made that product pay off, even if it's a product that they canceled.
We'll get into the Newton later, but even just... it really is interesting to me. I've never viewed the Newton as like a failure in that sense, like an utter failure. I feel like it certainly helped Apple think about and build on technologies that, later show up in the most successful consumer product in the history of humankind. So you really have to look at it in that regard, I think.
Mm-hmm. And Apple ended up selling their stake in ARM for like almost $1 billion. So even though they don't own it now,
I think they spent
they made some money,
40, 60 million, something like that on the Newton, but they well made it back on their investment. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So current Apple
Silicon.
What
do I think of what they're doing? I love them. Some of the best computers they've ever made. I think my favorite computers in the Apple, my first computer was an Apple Mac Plus, the first one that I owned. I went from an Apple IIe, which my wife won in a Crest back to school sweepstakes when we were in college. But I sold that and bought a Mac Plus after we graduated, and have been programming on the Mac since then. I used to do some shareware programs, one called Columns and one called Cribbage back in the day. But my favorites of all time, probably with Mac hardware, would be the Duo. Was pretty awesome. I still love the MacBook Air. Is still an amazing piece of hardware. And now I'm sitting in front of my MacBook Pro, and you'll get my M1 Mac when you pry it out of my cold dead hands.
Yeah, I mean, you were telling me that when you had the big acquisition, the company had bought you a computer. You immediately went out and bought one for yourself when you lost the company computer. And
right.
I think that's the thing with the Apple Silicon. Once you use it, you really cannot go back to Intel.
No, my wife got my old Intel MacBook Air because it works for her, but I needed to go on an M1. Yeah, so I own a 13-inch M1, and then for work I use a 16-inch MacBook Pro, which and the newer model, which is a lovely computer, gorgeous screen, little too heavy for me. Well, a lot too heavy for me as someone who has to put often now the two laptops in my backpack when I'm traveling. That gets a bit heavy. But I, work for a company that is in a banking industry and is highly regulated, and so that machine is pretty locked down in terms of security, which it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. You got the 13-inch M1 13-inch MacBook Pro. So that's that's basically the souped up MacBook Air.
Right.
What were the considerations for you in choosing between those two?
I probably would have been fine with the Air. I think the Air is a gorgeous machine, but I was on the Pro, and it was just like, it works really great for what I'm trying to do for programming, for podcasting, for blogging, and all those sorts of things. So it was just easier to just say, let me replace that one with this one.
Yeah, and so the new M2 MacBook, 13-inch MacBook Pro came out, and where everybody was pretty okay with the M1 version. With the M2 one, it seems like in general people are cranky that it exists, because we talked about it in the show. In fact, we were in the room with Apple when we said, man, I'm not really sure why this computer is here. Right. Remember, Steve, I remember distinctly looking at you and thinking there's like 6 people from Apple in the room while we're saying this.
None of them made that decision. It's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. And, but then after we aired that show, I actually heard from quite a few listeners that are Touch Bar fans or for various reasons still want that computer.
I use the Touch Bar, but I could give it up. It's not the feature that I need. I actually like the ports that they put back in the newer computers, putting back in the basic, the ability to put in a memory card for my camera when I do use a camera is something that was, very nice to have. But, gave that up. I don't have that on this one, but.
Yeah. Do you do any development work on it?
So I still do some of my own development. So when you're a software developer, so just to put this in concept, what it's like living with a software developer. So one example I thought of is about 20 years ago, my son was having birthday parties, and I wanted to be the cool dad, right, who did the cool scavenger hunt birthday parties. And so when you're a web developer and you're doing the scavenger hunt birthday parties, one of the clues for them, for instance, was a web address. And they were old enough to know what a web address was. And so they went on, it was like Amazon.com. They went on Amazon.com, and there on the Amazon.com front page, and the browser said Amazon.com, there was a picture of my son. And, because I had written a proxy server and installed it on that particular browser. So it wasn't really Amazon.com, but it basically said it was Amazon.com. And, there were a couple other tricks like that in there. So, when you're a developer, I wrote my own CRM system, not because it made sense to do, but you're a man with a hammer. And so there's some danger that you're going to do that. But I did write some software that I'm probably going to close down here. But it's when I went to contract full time, I wrote a program called bloggerbridge.com that was for bloggers and companies to connect, especially in the travel space, that I've been selling now since 2013, but really got clobbered by the pandemic, as one might imagine, when nobody really wanted to connect with anybody and wanted anybody to travel to the destination because you couldn't. So I still do some development on my personal laptop as well. Wrote my own program to manage my tweets and things like that.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. And then are you, you're an iPhone guy too? And
I am an iPhone guy. It's almost always, playing some podcast, because I am first and foremost a podcast junkie. So, regular listener of your show, just first time caller, but, and it's mostly a consumption device, I'd say, and mostly audio, for me.
What's your podcast app of choice?
I'm a Downcast user.
It's a good one.
Nothing against some of the other ones, but it's worked very well for me, and it does support the MP3 versions with the chapters and the Amateur Traveler. When it comes out, every thing we're talking about has a picture of what we're talking about, and so if you're on Downcast and a few other of the applications, you can see what the destination is that we're talking about, whether it's that castle or that museum or whatever. And then there's a link to that specific content, which takes a lot of time to put in. As a podcaster, I don't recommend that other people do it, but I've been doing it since, I think 2 episodes after Adam Christensen started doing it in 2005. So I think the first 5 episodes of The Amateur Traveler, I'm at episode 813. It's coming out this week. The first 5 versions didn't have it. Yeah, it's 17 years old. 17 and a little change.
Yeah, I've been using Forecast by our friend Marco Arment for that. And it does make it easier, but anytime you do chapters, we do it at a bunch of relay shows, but it is an extra bit of work, but I think it's worth it. I think especially for your use case where you want to show people what you're talking about, and they may not be in a position where they can open the app and scroll through the show notes, but it can just be on their lock screen. That's a fantastic use for it.
Yeah, some people tell me they'll listen in the car and then they'll come back and scroll through the pictures or something like that. And not all people have an app that they can use it. Not all people know about it. Not all people use it, but just enough do, and enough of my patrons use it that I keep doing it, even though my wife tells me I am nuts, which of course I am. I also do a faith-based podcast, the Bible study podcast, which is only 16 years old. That one does not have chapters and links because there's less need for that. And then I used to do 2 other podcasts, but something had to give at some point.
So that's your 16-year-old is your baby podcast.
That's right. Well, I did This Week in Travel for about 10 years before I opted out. And then I did a couple of years of Passport Travel Marketing and PR podcast. You can tell I got much better at naming podcasts based on SEO than when I did Amateur Traveler.
Although I really like Amateur Traveler. That's a great show. And I feel like you found it, Do you use the iPhone? I guess we'll talk about later for your content creation, but which iPhone do you use?
I'm on a 13, I think.
Sure.
I turned it off. I turned it back on and checked, but I don't remember off the top of my head. I believe that's the one I'm on right now.
And then iPad guy?
iPad Mini. Primarily for consumption. So if I'm on my iPad Mini, I'm playing something from my TiVo with the TiVo app if I'm on vacation, or I'm playing some game or something like that, some strategy game, more likely. Because I'm a board gamer when I can find people to play with me, but when not, I'm usually on my iPad Mini. So I wake up, the iPad Mini's the device next to the bed that I'm using for checking email and news and such, but I don't do a lot of creation on it. Except sometimes when I'm traveling, I will bring the keyboard, the little tiny keyboard, because in the airplane seat, if I'm working on a blog post, that's something that fits in a tray in the airplane seat better than even the small Mac.
So as someone who has been on Apple hardware since the Apple II, what's your general impression of Apple hardware at this point in time? How are they doing?
Oh, I think they're making some of the best hardware they've ever made. No, I think they're doing a real nice job. Having lived through the era of let's see, I had an LC, I had a Quadra, I had the Mac laptop that was on, what was it? The black one that was on the movie. I'm drawing a blank completely.
It was in
that's the one.
Mission Impossible?
Mission Impossible, thank you.
Yeah, like the 500 or 5,000 somewhere in there.
Yeah, had duos, had PowerBooks, I used to run Amateur Traveler for the first 3 months on an old 40 megahertz Apple in my office before I started hosting things. So, yeah, I had a lot of Macs over the years.
I get it.
This episode of the Mac Power Users is brought to you by TextExpander. Go to textexpander.com/MPU to learn more and sign up and get 20% off your first year. TextExpander is the original sponsor of the Mac Power Users. With TextExpander, you can get your team communicating faster so they can focus on what's most important and get your team's knowledge at their fingertips. Get your whole team on the same page by getting information out of silos and into the hands of everyone that needs to use it. You can share your team's knowledge across departments so your team is sending a unified message to your customers and isn't spending time reinventing the wheel. Here's how it works. First, you store it. You keep your company's most used emails, phrases, messaging, URLs, and more right within TextExpander. Then you share it. You get your whole team access to all the content they need to use every day. You can even organize it by department and then expand it. You can deploy the content you need with just a few keystrokes on any device across any apps you use. It's really that easy. TextExpander is available on the Mac, Windows, Chrome, iPhone, and iPad, and show listeners get 20% off their first year. To learn more, just go to textexpander.com/MPU to learn more and sign up. Our thanks to TextExpander for all of their support of the Mac Power Users.
We spoke earlier a bit about your programming background, and I wanted to kind of pivot that into a discussion of web apps as they stand today. I mean, I'm sure when you started, and definitely my earliest memories of getting on the internet, like it was mostly kind of a one-way thing, right? I'm reading someone's blog or looking at their webpage or looking at their photos, and then
if you were reading their blog, you were ahead of your time. So yeah,
that's true. If you're older than me, reading their posts on the bulletin board. But now it's it's hard to draw the line sometimes between what's a web app and what's native. And of course, things like Electron really blur those lines. But I mean, you've had a front row seat to this change over the years. How did we get to where we are now, where these web apps can offer really like rich and pretty complex functionality in a way that, again, like, I mean, there's a whole OS that's just based on the Chrome browser. How did we get here?
In steps is the real answer to that. I mean, if you go back, so I don't know if everybody has done it, but if you are not a web programmer, you can install the developer tools for free inside your Chrome, inside your Safari, and you can look at the source code for any web page that you're on. And when I say the source code, I mean the HTML. Then you can also get access to the JavaScript if they're using JavaScript and things like that. And that is the source code for the internet. I mean, that is still out there, and it's still the way it was in some ways ever since back in the days of Mosaic and Netscape and things like that. But then things happen sort of incrementally. One is we got more bandwidth. We can do more. We can have larger web pages. They can have more functionality. So that just changed over time, just because of Moore's law and a lot of things are going on there. But the other thing is then, when the first web pages came out, HTML 1.0, it was very simple. You can see an HTML 1.0, page and kind of recognize it for that. There's still a few companies who write as if that were still the case, but it didn't have any style, for instance. It didn't have style sheets. Those came later on. And the style sheets, if you get those developer tools, you can play with CSS, the cascading style sheets, which is why, you and I are looking at the workflow here, which is a web-based app. And I'm seeing we're in topic 3 and it's red. And if I right click on that or control click on the Mac and look at that from the developer tools, I can see why that is red. And it's basically defined because of there's some style that is correspondent with that. And the style sheets, added a level of richness, as well as, when we say that bandwidth made a difference, if you go back and look at really old web pages, little tiny photos, right? Because we were over modems when we were first using the web.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you still watch them load, even in the small ones. Yeah.
And so, the ability to put in videos, you couldn't have done, Netflix knew what they wanted to do, is my understanding, that they knew that they wanted to get to web streaming, but they didn't have the bandwidth. They didn't have the capability yet when they started. So they started with the DVDs. But they had an eye towards that's where we wanted to go, is the way that I've heard the story. I wasn't there. But, so some of those sets of things has happened where you get, faster computers, faster connections, especially, and then some additional web technologies. I mean, HTML 5.0 does more things that 1.0 didn't do, that allow us to have more interactions and things. And so even though we're still, a lot of the times when we're doing interactive programming on your browser, because your browser is running programs, typically JavaScript programs, that's the same JavaScript that goes back to LiveScript back to the 1990s, but it's been updated, it's been more modernized, but also you just have more capability. You can run things faster. Every time they announce a new version of Safari, one of the things they talk about is how fast does it run JavaScript? Because so many websites now are actually running and downloading programs on your computer that are, then running while they're there. And that's one of the reasons why, the web has gotten much more interactive, is you can have more capabilities for that. When I talk about we're using React is a JavaScript-based front-end engine that you basically get a big chunk of code downloads, and then you're in an application. It's not necessarily doing the same kind of back and forth that you usually do as you swip from one web page to another. You're just going to a different place in the JavaScript, if you will.
And the lines are just blurred a lot more.
The lines are blurred more, and you can then do things like React Native, and you can actually make that into an application or things like that. Well, and the other thing that changed is our first version, I mentioned being at Bodeswell, I was doing financial planning app. Our first version of our application, the back end for it was also JavaScript or TypeScript, a more modern JavaScript. And so, you can do with just knowing one language, you can now also do on the back end, we were doing database access and we were doing APIs, application programmer interfaces, which is how computers talk to each other, how programs talk to each other. With just, one language, you can do both. And a lot of companies do that. We moved off of that just because it wasn't as performant as some other languages like Kotlin, which we use, which is a Java-based language. But the capability of the computers getting faster and the technology and the bandwidth and all that kind of stuff has enabled people like me to do more cool stuff. But the one thing we should say with the Mac, there was an interesting moment, much more before the M1, and that was when OS 10 came out. And I think when OS 10 came out, I had actually left Apple, and my manager had required us to use Windows machines because all our users were going to be on Windows. And so for a while I was, doing Windows program, or it wasn't a Windows program, I was doing web programming, but I was on a Windows machine. But what we started to see a change in Silicon Valley, where I live, in terms of everybody carrying around a Mac, was when OS 10 came out, because OS 10 is a Unix machine and we host most websites on Unix machines. And so the fact that I had this portable Unix machine with me, I'm someone who had been a Unix programmer since 1983, 84. And, I'd been a Mac programmer for a while. And the first time somebody showed me a Mac and it's like, there's a Mac and, cool, that looks great. And then they opened up a terminal window that was seeing the underlying belly of the beast and it was Unix. It broke my head. It really hurt to see this inside of that. It didn't make sense at first, but, I take advantage of that all the time. The number one program I'm running usually 4 terminal programs at a time while I'm working, because I'm running all of the programs that will eventually be out there on AWS, running our application. I'm running them on my laptop. And they run fine and smoothly and seamlessly because it's very similar technologies. And so I'm running the front end and the back end, and the database and all of those things here, on my M1 Mac. And so when OS 10 happened, it really got a bump in terms of web development, making the Mac the definitive machine, because it was just harder at that point to develop on Windows machines unless you were doing a Windows stack, unless you were actually hosting on Windows. And there's less of that. It's less common. There's certainly some people who do that. Most of them I think are based in Seattle, but
yeah, and that's kind of the moment where BB Edit rises to the front of the room, right?
BB Edit.
Yeah,
love BB Edit. I still as the nerd who's doing the proxy server for the kid scavenger hunt, BB Edit is a great tool in your toolkit, because, for instance, even when I'm doing things like Amateur Traveler, so I'm recording an Amateur Traveler podcast and I'm listening to the guests speak, and as they're talking about some particular destination, I'm Googling it because I know I'm going to need to do show notes with the links, and so I've got all the links and I'm saving them as bookmarks. Well, then when I'm ready to do the show, I export my bookmarks and I select the set of bookmarks that are for this particular show, and I run a script that I wrote in BB Edit that turns those into a list of the name of the bookmark and then the link and then the space and then the name of, just a simple list that's going to go in the show notes. And then when I'm done with that, I run a different script in BB Edit and turn that into HTML and insert it in my web page. And so, having a tool that knows how to do regular expression matching and, can write scripts and things like that is a great tool for someone who's a programmer, just kind of as a utility tool. Mm-hmm. BB Edit is open on my laptop, definitely multiple times on a weekly basis.
Yeah, we may need to have you back someday to talk about the terminal, because I feel like that is something a lot of power users struggle with. Like I've learned terminal commands and I use them. I've got a file full of them that when I need to do something that I just can't do any other way. But in terms of actually working in the terminal, I don't really do that. I
don't know that most people need to do that necessarily. It is a useful tool to have in your toolkit if you're a programmer, but I don't know that most people these days, even programmers who I hire, I used to ask a question about, if you have this as a log file and it's got all your web logs from your application and you wanted to turn that into a list of what web pages were hit most often in sorted order and how many times were they hit. You can do that with 6 different shell commands piped into each other in the terminal. Yeah, most programmers couldn't answer that question anymore. So I don't think that's necessarily a problem. But if you can answer it, it's not a bad toolkit to have to just very quickly do things, not necessarily with programming, but just by combining different commands.
Now, what about the distinction between web apps and local apps? And I know, again, we're dealing with blurry lines, but there's a lot of people that are very opinionated about this. Like, when Apple started the iPhone App Store, they really put their flag in the ground saying, we want to make local apps for our devices. But now, if you look more recently, Apple's getting way more permissive about plugins in Safari. Sure. And it seems to me like there's something going on here. What's your take on this?
Well, economics, it makes a big factor in that. So, for instance, we did not have a web app or don't have a native app for our financial planning software. We have basically a responsive design so that it works fine on your iPhone and it works fine on your tablet and things like that. And with only 6 people in the company, only 3 programmers or 4 programmers, for 3.5, because my boss doesn't always have time to program. You can do an app, but once you dedicate one person to your iPhone app and one person to your Android app, minimum, it's tough to get things done. Where if you do the web app, you can eventually, we'll get acquired and then we'll have the money to do the native app. So a lot of it is just economics. If I could write once and make it work everywhere, that is why a lot of people focus on those. It's not necessarily that native apps aren't great, but that they're not necessarily as required. And when you think about the amazing apps you use these days, like going into the Google web tools, the Google Docs and things like that are really just web programs. It's clear that you can do a lot before you go to native. And when you go to native, then you're worrying about, how many different versions do I have to support? If I'm on, especially like if I'm on Android, how many different versions do I have to deal with? You have less of that on the iPhone, but, native apps are great, but, we even see that with, is that available on my Mac or is it only available on my iPhone or my iPad? And yet if you do a web app, it's available on all 3. And so we'll continue to see the advantage of both. I think, the local apps or the native apps are always, I think, going to be a little more responsive potentially. And there are probably going to be some things that you can do better in them than you can in the web app. But, we have definitely seen web programming go a lot further. And I think about during the day how few apps I actually use because so many of the things I go to these days are web pages. I think that's it. There are probably fewer apps that I open in a given day than I used to.
Well, I mean, you think back to the old PC versus Mac days, which is like in hindsight, so ridiculous. I mean, we were all a bunch of people that were nerdy about computers. We were such a small segment of the population. We should have all been friends, right? But man, those flame wars and the boards, they went after each other. But,
well, hey, I worked on a Windows project at Apple. Talk about being thankless.
Yeah, but the fact is, what killed that fight ultimately was the fact that so much of the work we all do now is on the web. It doesn't matter.
If you're a company and you need to write a proprietary application for managing your healthcare connect records at the hospital or something like that, you really would be foolish not to do that as a web app these days, because you're really having to bet on operating systems and programmings and things like that, where if you just do it as a web app, it's going to work everywhere. And don't have to worry about, well, can we then support it on the phone? You just have to worry about responsive design. And you guys know what I mean when I say responsive, right? I don't know how nerdy I'm being. But just that if you change the size of this window, things will appear and disappear as appropriate to fit on the size of the device.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And with people consuming the web on their phone, their tablet, and their 36-inch screen, you need to be able to look good in all places. Yeah.
Well, and a number of the, if you go into the Apple Store now and you do download a native app, a number of those native apps are actually web apps. They're actually done in a technology that is more web app centered, things like React Native or something like that. They may be a little less responsive. Apple might not like them quite as well, but it's, again, easier to develop. And so we'll see some of those that are kind of the hybrid ones also.
So explain for folks why sometimes using the internet kills the battery in their laptop so fast.
Well, it's how many, when your application is just sitting there, is it just sitting there is really the question. How active is your application? Is it constantly hitting the internet to find out if there's new data? Is there something spinning in there that is basically waiting for something to change, and it's doing an active ping of that information? I'm trying to put this in English. Actively looking for that information. Anything that's doing that kind of let me see if there's anything changed that doesn't have. Because often our web protocols make it a little harder to just let me know when something changes. And so there's some portion of your application that is awake even when it's not, even when it seems to be sitting here. And to the extent that is true, you'll be draining more battery life. You're draining your CPU at that point, or your power through your CPU. And you can write the same application in ways that are more efficient or less efficient, and that's just a matter of good programming, and that's true of whatever type of application it is, whether it's a native app or a web app or whatever. It's just that if it's a web app, it affects my AWS bill, not your battery. Is the big difference there?
Some people view this shift as threatening to Apple, that if everything is just going to be a web app, what makes the Mac or even the iPhone or iPad special? What do you think about that sort of line of thinking?
I think it's silly. I think everything isn't going to be a web app. I'm not worried about it as an Apple lover. They seem to be doing okay these days, especially, if they continue to make some, kick-ass soft hardware that, runs things better. In some ways, I think it helps Apple more than it hurts it, because if I'm, typically it used to be if I was a Windows developer and I wrote that application, I'd be writing it for Windows, and then you couldn't use it on the Mac at all, or you had to use it under emulation. And these days, if if everybody in the development world were to write as a web app, that would mean it would be available everywhere, and it's a more level playing field. I think Apple does better on a more level playing field. I think they've always had more hard time when, for instance, games is the place where we still see it, right? That those games are available more here or there. Then that makes that hardware purchase better or worse depending on where you sit in that divide. So web apps mean you're in a much more level playing field to the extent that they're out there. But again, I don't think it's going to be an either or. I think there's going to be both.
Chris, what browser do you use?
I'm a Chrome guy. I've got half a dozen different plugins on my Chrome. I jump to Safari when I'm doing testing occasionally. Safari unfortunately has a few more quirks that we. It used to be that back in the day when you were programming for your app, when you were done with your support for Windows 7, but you hadn't done Windows 6 yet, you were halfway done because there were enough things that were in Internet Explorer 6 rather. Internet Explorer 6 was, so bad that it was basically a tax on the internet for developers. And Safari has got a few quirks. It's not nearly like Internet 6, but it's got a few quirks that we run into some bugs. So I do have to jump over there. My designer runs in Safari all the time, so I get constant feedback with if there's something that's a little different. But most of the time, it doesn't matter that much.
Yeah, I could see someone doing development work wanting to run Chrome more. For me, I stick with Safari, frankly, because the battery life is so much better, and I'm all in with Apple anyway. But one of the complaints that we hear frequently from listeners about Chrome is that when you run Chrome, the battery dies faster. Chrome isn't as much of a team player with Apple hardware in terms of preserving battery life. You got any tips for people?
Well, you have to remember too, I'm running a web server and a database server and some development tools. And my laptops are often, plugged in much of the time. But even when they're not, the current generation of laptops has pretty good battery life. So I have any tips? No, honestly, I mean, fewer plugins is definitely a thing, but that's the reason I use it is I, have a dozen different plugins on my personal computer. My laptop for work, I think, doesn't have any plugins at all, just because, it's a little more locked down. But, and all the plugins that I have are mostly for, social media or for more content creation sort of things than they are for development. And well, there's a few things that are like help me measure the space between different devices, different things on the screen so I can see whether I've got my layout right. Because I often do a lot of UI work. And so if you're trying to get pixel perfect to the design you have, I have a few different plugins that I use for that. But mostly they're for more content creation, more for web programming, content creation.
So it's like when you go to the doctor and says it hurts when I do this, and the doctor says, well, then don't do that.
Don't do that. Yeah, exactly.
This episode of Mac Power Users is brought to you by Indeed. We're driven by what ifs. So what if hiring didn't have to be so hard? What if finding somebody great could be as easy as asking them to apply? Well, what if your dream hiring platform already exists? You need Indeed. It's the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. So instead of spending hours on multiple job sites searching for candidates with the right skills, Indeed is a powerful hiring partner that can help you do it all. Find great talent faster through time-saving tools like Indeed Instant Match, assessment, and virtual interviews. With Instant Match, over 80% of employers get quality candidates whose resume on Indeed matches the job description the moment they sponsor a job, according to Indeed Data US. And assessments are really great. Indeed helps star applicants to shine with over 135 assessment tests ranging from cooking to coding. Even better, Indeed's the only job site where you only pay for applications that meet your must-have requirements. Indeed is unbelievably powerful, delivering 4 times more hires than all other job sites combined, according to Talent Nest 2019. So join more than the 3 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. Start hiring right now with a free $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post. Just go to Indeed.com/MPU. This offer is good for a limited time. Claim your $75 credit now at Indeed.com/MPU. Terms and conditions apply. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Our thanks to Indeed for their support of the show.
Chris, in addition to all your work on the web and your programming, you're also a content creator. We've talked on the show already today about the Amateur Traveler podcast. I know you have a couple others as well. Amateur Traveler is my favorite, I'll have to admit. I just love what you guys do. And let's talk about travel and podcasting and content creation a little bit. First is obviously that we've had some changes in the world over the last few years, and people are starting to travel again. You told me as we were preparing that now you are on a plane about once a month.
These days, yeah. In part because I've been going back to see my daughter as our first grandchild is on the way, but also done, a work trip. Imagine that, I've done 2 different work trips that, we didn't used to do for a couple of years there. And then one international trip in a couple different travel blogging conferences, the TBEX conferences. It's nice to get back to those and do those in person again.
I'm sure a lot of listeners are starting to contemplate travel again. Any advice for the way things have changed and maybe good technologies or workflows to get through travel post-COVID? I don't know if we can say post-COVID at this point, but
I don't know if we're post-COVID yet. We're realistically, we're still losing 300 people a day in the U.S. to COVID. So, and personally, we've had more family members get COVID this summer than any other time during this. My 95 95, almost 96-year-old father got it this summer, but is okay. And my son and his wife got it. So I think what I've gotten definitely into the place of, I've got all my shots, I've got all my boosters. I wear a mask when I go indoors because I live in a place that still believes in that. And, I do a lot of outdoor dining, but I live in California. So it's, I like the outdoor dining. I hope we keep it. Even if nobody gets COVID, I really want to dine outdoors more. But I think a lot of us have gotten to the place of, take whatever precautions you think are appropriate. For me, I'm still wearing masks on planes. I don't care what the rules are and things like that. But don't put your life on hold anymore, I think is where some of us have gotten to, ready to get out there. And we've seen that the demand for travel, we had at least one day this summer, and I think multiple days, where the number of people at US airports was greater than pre-COVID. What we've run into, though, is because there were so many people getting, kind of this low-grade COVID, which is what we've seen a lot of this year, fortunately, fortunately, because of all the great work that the medical community has done with, treating it and, all the antivirals and those sort of things. But it still means that, somebody's sick and it's the flight crew and it's the plane, the captain of the plane and such. So they've had a lot of canceled planes. So if you're thinking about a trip this year, it's a great time for a road trip, except of course, gas being so expensive. But it's been a tough year to fly. There have been some really bad experiences. There have been so much lost luggage this year that we've seen airlines send empty planes over to go fetch luggage.
Wow.
Which is unheard of.
I wasn't aware of that.
Oh yeah, that we saw. Oh, if it was, I'm trying to remember what it was. Delta, sent over a flight to Heathrow to pick up all the luggage that got left behind. So it's been a bit of a. Yeah, there's no appropriate term that I would use on Mac Power users for that. It's been bad. It's
okay.
This summer in terms of how things have gone for a lot of international flights, especially. So, it definitely is one of those things where no one comes home and complains that they didn't bring enough. And a lot of people come home and say they packed too much. So this is a great year to learn to deal with a carry-on and packing in a carry-on. You do laundry at home, you can do laundry on the road. Pack clothes that can be washed out in the sink, potentially, or go to a laundromat or something like that. But you don't have to pack something for all your trip. Have maybe a flight app or TripIt or something like that that's going to tell you when there's a change in terms of gates and things like that. If you're booking your flights, have that information with you, because if your flight is canceled, you may have to rebook, and it's been a little bit of a hassle. I was coming home from one of the business trips from flying out of Boston, and they just completely screwed up trying to figure out. I think that the problem was that they had hot, warm weather conditions, and they couldn't take all of us on the flight with all the luggage without doing a fuel stop. But by the time they were making the decision, they took so long to try to make the decision, do we kick people off the plane or do we make a fuel stop, that the crew timed out. The crew now was over the legal limit in terms of how long they could fly. And so we were basically there another day with hours and hours of delay. So it has not been a good year for travel. As we've gotten back to it, we've gotten back to it a little poorly, but when you get there, it's still worth getting there. Workflows. Have my workflows changed for travel? Not so much. And my travel tech is largely, whatever's on my iPhone. I've got one of the two carriers that has international plans. So either Google Fi or, in my case, the T-Mobile. When I land in, one of 100 different international countries, I've got access to my email and, to the internet while I'm there for no additional charge. And I like that. And so, there's amazing things you can do when you have internet connections these days, like translation of menus, or like looking for hotel rooms when you're trying to get to another place, or figuring out where the bus station is, and all of those things that we do with maps. And so, the iPhone is just a dream device for if we had been thinking about what device we wanted, 20 years ago for travel. we would have come up with half of what the iPhone does. I think,
Yeah.
it's even better than we could have imagined. Especially, but if you have a data plan, right? If you are connected, and so that connection piece is, I think, important. And if you don't have one of those carriers, getting when you land, getting a international SIM to put into your phone, and then letting people know what your new phone number is, makes that happen pretty easily these days.
Yeah, I had to get a flight recently, and I got into the gate, and they delayed me like 4 hours. And
Yeah.
I think that is just something that's happening a lot more often. And I
Well,
fortunately,
they're short. They're short of crews because of COVID, because they stopped training pilots when COVID happened because they didn't need as many, and they've had a lot of pilots retire. We had a lot that hit retirement age, and so there's going to be a shortage for a while of airplane crews. And then the COVID has made it just so that it's hard for them to predict. That's where we've had a number of problems there.
yeah, when I hit that 4 hour delay, I know this is entitlement, but I have TSA pre-check. I got it years ago, and I love it, right? But because of that, I can get back through security very quickly. So rather than sit in the terminal for 4 hours, I just left and went out, dined outside, and then came back shortly before it left. And I felt like that was a good move because I always worry about getting sick when you're in the terminal for hours at a time. But yeah,
It depends where you are too and how much space they have. If you're at the gate, obviously a little more densely, and it depends on the airport. Actually, I think a lot of airports have gotten to be nicer places to hang out. But not necessarily nice, not my favorite place to hang out, but nicer than they used to be.
But you're also, when you get to your destinations, you're making content for Amateur Traveler and some of your other endeavors.
Mm-hmm.
One of the products you're using that I've been wanting to talk about on the show now for a long time is Descript. Could you explain what Descript is and how you're using it?
So Descript is a piece of elfin magic that can be used to edit podcasts and videos. I use it for podcasts and other audio. I say it's elfin magic. I mean, it's literally made by the elves who made the cookies in the trees. It's just fascinating to even watch. You load in your content. In my case, I'm loading in 2 different audio files, the guest and me, because I'm doing an interview show most of the time. And then you press a button and it magically removes all the ums and the ahs and the knows and the wells and the 400 different ones in a 45-minute show. And it doesn't do that, I'd say 100% accurate, but it does it pretty darn good. I still have to listen through the show, but it also gives you a transcript. And so when you edit the show, you're not editing audio. And, those of us who've edited audio get used to looking at waveforms and saying, well, that must be where they said the. But when you're in Descript, you're editing the. If they said the twice, you click on it and you select it and you delete it like you would in a WordPress document. And it then edits the audio and gets rid of that. And it's like 99, 98% accurate. So there's occasionally places where it didn't catch that this was a word. And so you may need to, cut the audio a bit or extend it because it cut it too short, but not that much. And so I said, doing a level of edit for a show to try and make it really clean without the ums and the ahs and the pauses and the, let me look that up and all those sorts of things. I used to say it would take me about 1 hour for 10 minutes of audio. And then I got faster when I still use Hindenburg, and Hindenburg I can edit at 1.7 speed. And so I get faster there. But now I'm editing a 45-minute show in about 45 minutes, which is pretty cool. So it's a pretty cool piece of technology. I still use Hindenburg because I'm putting in the chapters with Hindenburg. So I'll mark where they go. You can put in mark points with Descript, although it doesn't carry over into Hindenburg. I then have to look at the time code and mark where it is in Hindenburg, and then put in the link and the name of the chapter and the graphic in my case as well. But yeah, Descript has been a real eye-opener, time saver. I actually have stopped using an editor in the show just because it's more reliable for me to do it with Descript and I get it done faster.
It also works with video, and
I haven't tried it with video. Yeah.
Yeah. And depending on what the video shows, like if the video shows a person's face, I find it jarring. But,
talking heads would be harder.
Yeah. But it's just the idea of an edit based on text as opposed to waveforms is kind of the the big idea that Descript does. And I've heard from a lot of listeners that are using it as well. I think it's really starting to take off, and it's a very interesting service that is a web app. It's something you do over the internet.
Right. No, very, very cool piece of software. Yeah, no, I'm doing some video, but I'm not doing a lot of video for the show. I do video when I'm doing blog posts, because the Amateur Traveler is also a blog. Shooting almost all video and 90% of my photographs these days on the iPhone, because it's there, because it's good, because it's got both the zoom lens now and the wide angle lens. When I'm doing a hotel review, for instance, it's great to have that wide angle and be able to get the whole hotel review, the whole hotel room. Sorry, and then also doing some panoramas, both horizontal and vertical. A lot of people don't think about doing panoramas the other way, but if you're trying to do something that's a little larger, then you can. So, I love the iPhone as my input device. I'm taking my notes on there. I don't carry a paper and pen when I'm doing notes for an interview or something like that. I'm not yet at the point where I'm recording it or transcribing it or anything like that, but I'm not tending to do that level of interview. I'm just trying to capture a few quotes for the article or something like that. But I discovered, I was telling David before we were recording, that I used to carry, I still have an SLR, and I carry that when I think I'm going to be using something that I need a really good zoom for. And I was on the top of a jeepney, riding on top of a jeepney in Philippines, up by the rice terraces of Batad, and I was filming some video with my iPhone, and probably iPhone 7 or something like that at that point, and then was filming some with my expensive SLR, and the stabilization was so much better on the iPhone, I ended up using only that video, and basically at that point stopped shooting video with my SLR. I still have a GoPro that I'll use, for instance, for underwater photography or something like that, which I should have bought before I went to the Galapagos last year, but I bought it just afterwards. But I still like the GoPro because it's very portable and great for that kind of action shots. But if I'm not doing underwater, I usually just use the iPhone.
It reminds me of those old, maybe not that old. It floats around every few years. A photo of, these are all the things you used to need to create, right? And it was a camcorder and a PC and an audio interface and a still camera. And now, you're walking around making world-class content with the phone that you also use to check Twitter. It's astounding.
I still have brought a Zoom H4 along with me on some trips. So for instance, the last time I was in Africa on safari, I have an episode of the Amateur Traveler on Botswana that I was doing an interview of our safari guide on the Zoom H4, and that's the only interview I've ever done that was interrupted by a lion. But I was glad I had a good device for capturing that audio. I don't usually do that on the iPhone just because of quality of audio.
And you could also throw the recorder at the lion if you had to run.
Exactly. We came a little too close.
This episode of the Mac Power Users is brought to you by SourceGraph. Go to sourcegraph.com for universal code search so you can move fast even in big code databases. So you've hired a brilliant developer. That's great, but now you need to get them onboarded. And if your company is growing, onboarding new developers will be a common occurrence, but it's a big undertaking each time. One of the biggest challenges for new hires is to get them up to speed with the project their team is working on. This can be tricky if the code bases your developers are working on are already large. Thankfully, SourceGraph makes it easy to move fast even in those big code bases. Developers know that knowledge is most useful when it's findable. Centralization is helpful, but given the fact that most companies store knowledge in at least 2 different locations, how do you make knowledge accessible to those that need it? As a code intelligence platform, SourceGraph gives developers what they need to drive their own learning over time and in different situations. Teams without SourceGraph need to rely on asking colleagues or reviewing out-of-date documentation, which is cumbersome and time-consuming. But with SourceGraph, every developer can search across millions of repositories to find specific code, saving time for themselves and everyone else. So when questions do come up, it's the big stuff worthy of extra time. SourceGraph was created to make developers' lives easier, and today they work with leading companies across every industry, including 3 out of 5 of the top tech companies, plus PayPal, Uber, Plaid, GE, Reddit, and Atlassian. So visit about.sourcegraph.com to learn more. That's about.sourcegraph.com to find out how some of the biggest tech companies in the world use SourceGraph and to see what it can do for yours. Or click the link in the show notes to let them know you heard about it here on the Mac Power Users. Our thanks to SourceGraph for their support of the Mac Power Users and all of Relay FM.
So, Chris, we like to close these episodes with some favorites, some apps, services, hardware that maybe we haven't gotten to mention yet. Does anything come to mind?
There's a few standbys for me. Things like, Jump Cut, which is just a really good clipboard management app. I don't know how I would live without it. Trip Mode is a cool app for you're on vacation and you have limited access to the internet, or you don't want to have all those background processes hitting the internet, and Trip Mode allows you to disable on a process by process basis which applications can get to your internet. Really great on the Mac. Text Expander. I mean, you guys have talked about it so many times, but let me throw in my 2 cents that every time somebody sends me a pitch for, can I do a guest post on your blog, which I do allow guest posts, I can type 6 characters and send them back my guest post guidelines or something like that. Those sort of things that help me manage my email. I use it for a lot, but also every time I start an episode of either podcast, I type 6 letters or something like that, and it turns into a template for the blog post. And it's just a great app to have that. I think I was using a different expander thing, and then you guys talked about Text Expander so much, so I bought it. So you owe me that one. And then BB Edit we talked about earlier. BB Edit is my nerd tool that gives me access to basically to have a programmable text editor, and the ability as a nerd to do a programmable text editor is just pretty cool.
And you mentioned TripIt a little bit earlier in the show. Could you go into what it provides for you?
Sure. Yeah. Actually, we talked about it when I was on the show before, a long time ago. But TripIt is an app that helps you manage your trip itinerary. And so if you, for instance, get that confirmation email from the hotel or from the flight, you can just forward that to plans@tripit.com. It looks and sees who it's from and says, oh, Chris has got another trip going on. And so it puts together an itinerary for you and combines in a, usually an intelligent fashion that, that hotel must be on this same trip because it's in between the departure and the return flights. And so you can then, from your TripIt app, you can see, where all you're going and when, and it'll put it on your calendar, and you didn't have to enter it, which is the thing that's pretty fun with that particular application. Then I can give, my wife access to my TripIt account, and it's like, this is where all the trips are, and she can have access to that calendar that's syncing, that TripIt is syncing to, and see where I'm going and where I'm staying, and it all just happens pretty much automatically. All I have to do is forward an email or two. Good technology, and that's just the free version. If you get the paid version, then you can get things like changes for flight notifications and things like that. But even just the free version is pretty good technology.
For years, my go-to has been an Apple Note per trip with like some PDFs and pasted in text, which doesn't scale super well. But I took a couple of trips this summer for the first time in 3 years, and I used it as a time to play with Flighty, which is this flight tracking application that gives just an unbelievable amount of detail. It's by Ryan Jones. He was behind Weatherline, which sold, I think, in the last couple of years. But it was amazing to me because I've always just used the, whatever airline I'm traveling with, their app, right? And of course, I still had those notifications set up from years ago. It was still just on my phone, like dormant. But Flighty would often alert me of, hey, your gate has changed or your incoming flight is late, faster than the airline would. I was like, I don't know how you guys have this information, but it's incredible.
Well, and the other, thinking of flights, the other standby that's still a good app, web-based app, is Seat Guru, in terms of which seat to get on the plane. And I should disclose that I worked on Seat Guru when I was the director of engineering for TripAdvisor's flights, but it's still a good app. I just haven't seen anything else that comes quite as close as doing that one.
Do you think that people need to find something, specific like Flighty or TripIt? I mean, do you cringe when you hear me saying, "Oh, I just stick it all in Apple Notes and hope for the best"?
I think it's whatever works for you, but I find that it's a lot easier to do it in TripIt for that kind of information. I mean, I will have, so the way I organize things. So when I'm doing a lot of travel, so when I was contracting for and doing consulting for about 6 years, I was working about a third of the year. So I was traveling a whole lot more. And of course, doing a lot of sponsored travel because of the podcast and the blog. And so that meant I didn't have one trip in progress. I was planning 3, 4, 5 trips at a time. Right. And so at that point, having, here's my itinerary here in TripIt, and then, I probably my notes in Apple Notes also, because I tend to use Apple Notes for a variety of things, both for my engineering notebook, what commands do I need to run to do that thing again? I used to use Evernote for that, but switched to Apple Notes so that it could synchronize between different computers, and have it on my phone and my iPad as well. But I'll have some notes in there for the trip as well. But then also in my email, I have a travel folder that has a lot of different sub-travel folders, one for each trip, so that I can keep track of, okay, for that conference I'm going to, I got this email, so that when I'm there, I know when that party is, or, here's the thing that I got from Visit California about, hey, when you're in this area, we'd love to do this with you, or something like that. And so my folders for travel tend to be a little more elaborate than most, just because I might be coordinating, so many different things at the same time. And you just don't want to be standing in a place where you need that information and you don't remember where you put it. Search works okay, but it's nice if you can just go right to where it is.
Yeah. You mentioned you can share your TripIt information with your spouse or whoever you're traveling with. Right. Does it give you I'm just asking for my own personal use. This is just Steven exploring a new app at this point.
Understand.
But one thing my wife and I like to do, like we spend a week in Colorado over the summer, and we have always used Trello for like, okay, these are the 15 things we'd like to do. And then as we narrow it down, okay, Monday gets a column, Tuesday gets, what's the collaboration like there?
Yeah, not going to replace your Trello board. Doesn't do that.
Yeah.
There are some pro versions. Actually, there's a version that you can use for PR people that will help you coordinate, lots of people's different travel when you're doing a press trip or something like that, but really not the same app as what you'd need for you and your wife doing your Trello board.
Gotcha.
So yeah, no, for us, that's my wife, for some reason, that is a very analog process for her. She doesn't believe that the trip is planned until she's got her 8.5 by 11 piece of paper with boxes on it, with the different days, and drawn her calendar out. Everything else is on the computer, but that for her is when she believes that she's got a trip plan.
Fascinating. So, hey, it works, I guess.
I've been married for 40 years, so you got to make her happy.
That's good advice.
Okay, so that wraps it up for today. You can find us over at relay.fm/MPU for the Mac Power users. You can find the MPU forums over at talk.macpowerusers.com. Thank you to our sponsors, SaneBox, TextExpander, Indeed, and SourceGraph. In the More Power Users episode, we're going to be talking about Chris and Apple in the 90s, and otherwise, we'll see you next week.